Great. So as we're getting started, I want to make a couple of AGO announcements. And I'll be admitting folks at the same time. We've got Sean, our executive director, on the call. So first of all, our deadline for registering for the symposium is coming up. Our deadline is April 18th. The symposium is going to be April 30th to May 2nd, and it's in Providence, Rhode Island. So it's on the East Coast this year. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers and activities and opportunities to network. So if you haven't already registered, please do. We do have online registration for $75. And I also want to talk about the ongoing gleaning census. So on the screen, you can find some information about how to participate in the gleaning census. At least I hope that's what you're seeing right now. Give me the thumbs up. Okay, cool. Thanks, Sean. So to participate in the gleaning census, we started this census, we conducted a census 5 years ago in 2020, and we're redoing that process now so we can update everyone, ourselves, our funders, our communities, about the current state of gleaning. So the first step to participate in this, and you'll find all of this information on our website under the tab marked Gleaning Census. So in order to participate, there are two principal parts. The first is to complete an online questionnaire, and that'll take you about 30 minutes. You really need to have your budget data for the past couple years and volunteer data for the past couple years at hand in order to, go through that fairly quickly. And then the second is to calendar an appointment with either Sean or I to go through, it's about a 45-minute questionnaire, again, where you'll be telling us more about your organization, more that can be captured in a, forms fill out. And so at the end of that process, we're going to have a lot of information about you. And when we go to publish this at the end of 2025 and into 2026, we'll be feeding this information back to you, back to our funders, back to our communities about the current state of gleaning. So if you or your organization haven't already started to participate in this process, we would really appreciate that. And we think you're going to get great value out of it. I know I'll speak for myself. I enjoy these in-depth discussions with all of you. So for those of you who've participated, thank you. For those of you who've yet to participate, we look forward to speaking with you. And once again, this is all on our website under the tab marked Gleaning Census. And so now I want to turn it over to Charlotte, and Charlotte is one of our members. Charlotte works in Hawaii, so she's up really early this morning to host this call. And so Charlotte works with Kokua Harvest. So Charlotte, thank you so much for agreeing to do this and for bringing us the wonderful resource that is Adam.
Thank you. Aloha, everyone. It's really my pleasure to introduce today my friend Adam Wilson as our guest speaker. We met in Canada a couple years back in the context of the Orphan Wisdom School. And yeah, Adam he's a farmer, he's an amazing baker and cook, and he's an incredible writer. And he also stewards and is the custodian of the Sand River Community Farm in upstate New York. The farm grows and gleans food, which is offered as a gift to anyone who's hungry. Adam has been experimenting in gift-based non-market community feeding for many years prior to being in this farm. And he often says that his farm is not trying to fix or rewrite or uproot the system, but it's just asking big questions around neighborliness, what it means to share, what it means to sit at a table together. And he often speaks to what it'd be to remember and reincorporate our mutual sustaining relationships to each other and the world at large and all that is non-human. And so Yeah, we really hope today that you'll enjoy this conversation and encourage you to ask questions and share what comes up for you. And yeah, it's a gift to have you, Adam. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Do you want to start out with a question, or do you?
Yes. So I guess one of my first questions for you is how did the peasantry school and this project at the farm start for you from where you were in your non-market
Mhm.
gift food giving community service?
Mhm. There are a few different starting points, but one would be the beginning of the pandemic, which I know changed a lot of things for a lot of people involved in the work of wondering who needs food and who's hungry, maybe redefining those questions. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I had stopped farming for business a couple of years prior for a whole lot of reasons that maybe I'll leave off for now, and if we get into them, we get into them. But I was still baking and selling bread, but my farming operation became sort of a community homestead, or like we were basically asking landowners to allow us to graze sheep and cattle on their unused fields, plant gardens, and the food was being served at these big community suppers that we were putting on at the town hall. And so there was no staff for that project. I had a bakery business that was profitable enough that I just quietly covered the bills behind the scenes. And so when the pandemic rolled around, I had a feeling for a while that it's not all that transparent to just have like, well, who pays for all the bills for, not that there were very many, maybe $4,000 or $5,000 to run the farm, because it was all just neighbors chipping in, working together to share food. And anyway, so I decided to stop selling bread, and I told my neighbors that I was going to stop selling bread. This is a week or two into the pandemic when people were going for walks one-on-one outside, wondering how far they're supposed to stand apart from one another. And every single one of them asked me, because I was no longer going to have any income, I was going to offer the bread as a gift alongside the food from the farm. We could no longer hold feasts, but we were going to open a gift stand every week, and the bread was going to be offered as a gift, and the ingredients from the farm we were going to cook into a big pot of soup and offer quarts of soup to people in town at a gift stand. And these neighbors, almost every single one of them said, well, but who's going to take care of you? What's going to happen to you? And I hadn't really planned what to say, but my response was, I kind of figured you might help me out if I got in a bad way. I mean, these were people who I'd been working alongside to put on these beautiful community suppers always with a big dance afterwards. And every single one of them said, well, sure, of course I would. Of course I would take care of you if you got in a bad way. And I said, well, what if there were 40 of you, and why can't we live in that world? Make it 60. What if there were 60 of you? What if there were 100 of you? And so I just basically, from that moment until now, I just moved into that world where neighbors have the capacity to uphold one another. And it's been a grand adventure. I haven't sold a thing since April 15th or March 15th of 2020. And I've basically asked people, rather than paying me, to sustain me. And that distinction is a bit mysterious, but it's really important to me. Because there are most of the farmers that I know are asking their customers to pay them, and they're not being sustained in any measurable or unmeasurable way. And I just keep experimenting with different incarnations of sharing food as a gift. As Charlotte said, our tagline is, this food is offered as a gift to anyone who's hungry for any reason. And as a way to slightly disrupt the immediate slip into the rut of charity, when people say, well, who's included in that invitation? I'll always say, well, I find that I usually get hungry at least once or twice a day, and I eat the food from the farm. So that's a little beginning of an answer to that question. There's obviously plenty more.
Yeah, that's amazing. That so many other questions sparked into my mind about said, and I'm not sure where to bring it. I guess what I'm pondering right now is sort of, as you're asking to be sustained instead of paid, I just think of like the society and how we really um our profit and how much we get paid and our productivity is a huge part of our self-worth and our
Mhm.
identities. And I just wondered like how you've reframed success in that
Mhm.
process. Like what have you had to let go of in order to not just use this different vocabulary, but really live it?
Mhm. Well, so I have this practice that is not this phrase that I really am fond of, that is, many other people are not as fond of this phrase as I am. And I'll tell you how I came about this phrase, which is the question, as you can imagine, came up fairly often at the gift stand, or say at those gratitude feasts we were hosting at the town hall. Well, like there's a lot of middle class people here that are eating this food that has no charge, so it must be free, even though everything that we put out always says the food is offered as a gift. Nothing that we do is free. There's zero things can cost $0 but not be free. Let me tell you, it is possible. And we can talk more about the difference between free and a gift, because I'm sure it impacts every single one of your workplaces. Like, are we asking people to feel grateful or not? And what does that mean? To have, what does it mean to live in a society where we've decided that it's actually undignified to have to feel grateful at all? And we live in an extremely broken society. But if that's the direction we're headed, where no one should ever have to feel grateful against their will, no one should ever be obliged to have to feel grateful, I think we're pretty far off the mark of where we're headed. We can get more into that. But so people kept saying, well, how are you going to get the food to the people who need it most? And as you can imagine from what you've heard so far, I was always trying to like answer in a way that made people think rather than allowed them to settle back into what they were expecting. And so I'd say, well, we're not going to. We just set up the gift stand every week. We put out a transparent budget request that includes all of the personal stipend requests for folks who labor on the farm, including myself. I ask for $4,000 a year right now from people who care about me, and they send in 10. Very nice of them. And anyway, but that answer didn't totally satisfy people. Well, but how, what? And finally, I figured there was a deeper answer to that question about who needs the food most, and how do we know who needs it most, and who am I to decide who's experiencing what forms of scarcity and for what reason? It's pretty easy to do it, though. I have the programming. I was born a middle class person who knows what a poor person's supposed to look like, right? Missing teeth, pretty good indicator that they need food, but I don't, because I don't have needs, because I'm not a needy person, right? Anyway, anyway. So I finally said, I thought this was going to end the project. I said, the work of the farm is not to help poor people get rich, but rather to invite rich people to consider voluntary impoverishment as a moral, even a joyful choice in a time of cascading ecological and social troubles. And one of the people that heard that invitation was one of my neighbors who, after actively trying not to accumulate money for the first 20 months of the pandemic, needed to move. And I didn't own land. I have a little tiny house that's on a trailer. Had no money to buy land and couldn't immediately find someone else in town who was willing to host. I also have this movable kitchen that's built into a shipping container. And so someone in that neighborhood knew that I needed a place to move and stepped forward and said that they had inherited family money and wrote a check for $500,000 to purchase the farm where I live now and take it off the market. And now the title's been transferred over to a nonprofit. So there's a lot of ways to describe that term voluntary impoverishment, what it means to me. But so, for example, my practice is I keep my personal bank account under $4,000, and I don't ask anyone else to do this first. It's just sort of a practice. So then I have to ask people for help. So like to come to the meeting today, I had to ask my neighbors to borrow a car. And so I try to practice some of these things that I'm imagining people who I might be sharing food with are totally normal to them. People who aren't middle class, who still share cars amongst family members or whatever. And mostly I find it really humbling, but also really like it builds connections with my neighbors. And I'll stop there for now. So for me, success is, here's to loop it back. For me, digging into the felt sense that I could be worthy to ask my neighbor to inconvenience themselves to be without their car for an hour and a half while I go to take this call. That's how I know I'm digging into like that I'm living in such a way that I feel like they feel grateful for me because they see my work as of service and they see me working to build a stronger web of community in the neighborhood. And they're like grateful when I ask to borrow the car because they're like, gosh, we're glad Adam needs something so we can help him out. So that's how I would answer that question.
Wow. You know, in your answer, I've noticed kind of a high level of discomfort in my body. Talking, there's many things that you brought up that I was like, oh God, like I could just like what you were saying about the programming or the grooves, like I just felt so many of my programming in my grooves kind of get tossed by what you were saying, and felt kind of like puking, you know. But you're bringing up things that are really, they're just questions that we ask ourselves as Gleaner and Gleaner communities, you know, the like, who needs the food, you know, are we having equitable distribution to people? Yeah, what is neighborliness and relationships, and you know, and as like gleaning organizations and nonprofits, we're just like chasing, sorry, there's a bus, we're like chasing money all the time, you know, and we're like the Trump administration and our funds, and so it just yeah, there were so many pieces that you spoke to that felt like they were leagues away from the consideration that we have, or like you've taken these into really big dark forest trails that are yeah, and it kind of brings me to this question. I just also want to open up to anyone and anybody's questions. I love you, Adam, and we've talked about these things, and our teacher talks a lot about, you know, indebtedness and gratitude, and so these are topics that we swim around in. But so please, yeah, raise your hand or just unmute yourselves or in the chat.
What I'd love to
there
maybe
is
just
a chat. There is a chat question. How do you think this has changed the relationships in your community? And why do you think those relationships have changed?
Yeah, Adam, that question was, Adam, that question was for me. I was just curious, like, as you shifted this idea, I mean, I think there was a lot of shifts that happened here, and I'd love to sort of dig into some of them. But I'm curious how you felt like the relationships within your community changed with this model, and what, and I guess sort of like, why do you feel like they changed in that way? Or maybe, or if they didn't change, that would be interesting to know as well. Does that make sense?
Sure. So I've done this work in 2 different towns now in 2 different states. One was in Vermont, and Vermont is much more upper middle class, highly educated, liberal demographic. And now I'm across the lake in New York, much more working class. The town where I'm in is actually one of the poorest towns in the Adirondack Park. And more conservative, more Trump signs. And I'd say the work has changed as a result of being in those 2 different places. And I'll say, when I go back to the town where I used to live in Vermont for the first 20 months of the pandemic, and before that, the work was getting going in its form that I described, of hosting those monthly feasts for about 1.5 years. There's that project doesn't exist anymore. Brushbrook Community Farm, that ended, but there are now these webs of people who share food with one another and not only share food, but obviously favors tractor borrowing, and you know, there's this web that exists because we did that work so intensively for that period of time. But one thing that's been really important to me is that I've heard a lot, I get called a visionary quite a lot, and I really have to push back against that. And I didn't know exactly first how to, and then I realized that the reason that, because people, this gift economy term is a little sexy right now. Probably a lot of you on this call have read Robin Kimmerer's work, Braiding Sweetgrass, and her more recent book, The Serviceberry. Charles Eisenstein's written about it. And I had read all those books. Well, anyway, back in the day. This would have been like 5 years ago. But actually, how I learned what the actual practices would be around neighboring was because I spent a lot of time. I'm a dairyman. I was a dairyman back then. I'm not milking cows right now because my neighbor milks cows. So I help out with milking, and they just say, take as much milk from the bulk tank as you'd like. But I've spent a lot of time going in visiting old dairy farmers in their barns while they're milking. And to have a younger person being interested in what they know means a whole lot to them. And I found when I was hearing the visionary thing, I would tell people that everything I learned about gift economy, I learned by talking to the old dairy farmers, the oldest dairy farmers I could find, that if I sat with them long enough, eventually they would tell me a story of the time old Sally broke her leg. And it could be Sally, or it could have been Skip or Jack or Gertrude. But so what happened when she broke her leg? All the neighbors figured out how to get her cows milked for 6 weeks until her leg healed up. She had no insurance policy. There was no hours tracked, no money exchanged hands. It wasn't a barter tab. And it wasn't a gift economy, it was a neighborhood. And overlapping neighborhoods formed a village. And I've heard that, and it could be that the person who's telling me that story, this is New England here, so they're European American old farmer types. It could have been that story goes back to their parents or their grandparents' generation, but there's contact within living memory of people for whom the idea that your neighbor would be without food would be it would be morally unacceptable. And the state wasn't involved in ensuring, and there weren't charity organizations that were involved in ensuring people had food. So for me, that's all the gift economy is a commitment to caring for one another in a way that's been lost in just a couple of generations. And so I don't like to think, so someone said that maybe my work is more to help middle-class people remember their way back to what people knew just a few generations ago, but now we need a new term for neighboring. It's like we need terms for things that people didn't have words for. It was just sort of the way that people lived not that long ago. I was thinking I could offer you just a snapshot of what we actually do at Sand River Community Farm. So because we do glean a lot. Gleaning is really important to us. We grow vegetables, raise sheep and cattle. We cook and serve food in the form of gratitude feasts, where we have 80 to 120 people come and sit down family style for a meal, always with a dance afterwards. We find that dance is really beautiful in helping people bridge connections across the generations, but also across, it's a good way to get to know one another. We always say a blessing before the meal. We host weekly work days we call farm frolics, and we'll have anywhere from 6 to 30 or 40 people show up to tend gardens, livestock, repair buildings. We renovated the old barn with $0 of expense because people chipped in and picked up the screws we needed on the way there. And we work with some neighboring farms to glean unused produce that we'll preserve. Through the winter months, when it's too cold to host large gatherings at the farm, we make 25-gallon pots of soup every other week, freeze it into quarts, and distribute that food at the library in town. And then we just were given a spot in town at the community garden that another nonprofit organizations founded, but found that they didn't really have the staffing to do much there. And that was a real blessing for us, because we've found that being 2 miles outside of town, folks who don't have cars, who are unhoused, there's quite a few recently released inmates in town. It's a very, very poor town. And they're just not going to make their way 2 miles out to the farm. So having a spot in town, we're going to start serving lunch every Saturday at noon, as it warms up, at the community garden, as a way of building relationships of trust across class, and invite people to come and help out the following day on Sunday at our work days, and offer to organize rides. And our total budget, like, I think we're gonna make a budget request for $18,000 for the whole year, which includes purchased inputs for the farm, the electric bill. It includes some renovations we're going to do to one of the buildings. That's $5,000. Anyway, so just to give you a sense how small the budget is. We don't pay property taxes because the town has abated the taxes because of the nonprofit owns the land. And I receive my personal stipend request from folks who read the writing that I put out into the world, to the tune of about $4,000. So that's just to give you a snapshot. We don't use any grant money. We ask people who care about what we do to support us.
Evan, how big is the community that you live and operate in? Just a sense of the size.
Yeah, the town of Keysville, this is a maybe 10,000. It's a town that had a thriving mill industry up until the 70s, and when the mills closed, so it's like a post-mill town that hasn't had any isn't a tourist town. It doesn't have, like, other towns in the Adirondack Park have a huge tourist industry, but not this one.
Is there a faith tradition underpinning your practice?
Great question. No. But as you can imagine, people, like, sometimes I think the work would be easier to do if it was just a Christian project, because it'd be easier for people to place, but it's just not. I mean, I do go to church myself, but the project is not a Christian project. And there's ways in which that would limit who would walk in the door, right? But I do think of neighboring as a sort of a faith that people used to carry that's been largely lost.
Yeah, I was gonna say, for me, when you were explaining your projects, I felt a feeling that there was trust and faith, and that you have to find refuge in that trust and faith between each other. So maybe Neighbor Leaves does have
Mhm.
that expression.
Charlotte, when you said part of what Adam had initially said made you want to throw up, do you want to reflect back to us what was very uncomfortable for you about those initial statements?
Yeah. It just was the honest feeling I had in my body, which I didn't expect, because I love your writing, Adam. I read it. I also live under the poverty line. I've been on food stamps. I've, like, toyed with these things, but I felt like you had pushed it in just such further directions. And I think that, and I was going to ask you about this, but for me, it's this feeling of refuge. I feel like things are so uncertain, and it
Mhm.
almost feels like you've, like, jumped off a cliff into, yeah, a type of a faith and trust that is probably, or has become a form of refuge, but for me just feels like, like vertigo,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that's kind of
Mhm.
that sense of puking of, like, can we really believe that? And I mean, I I talk about these themes and play around with this in my head a lot, and in my organization too, with Cocoa Harvest. And but I feel fear, and
Mhm.
I feel fear that it's not possible, and I feel fear for these times and for climate change and for people and our future and my child, and so I kind of battle with just sort of values and love and heart, and also the realities of this time. And I don't know if I told you, Adam, and I definitely didn't tell you guys, but I lived for a year at sea in the South Pacific. And I grew up in the West. I'm from France, in a very, yeah, highly educated society. And where, yeah, we value a lot like our productivity, our work. Women don't breastfeed their kids because they work and they're cool like that. And, feminism is just like, we work as hard as the guys and we would never be milking cows for our children. and,
Mhm.
and so there's just like this element of grinding that's part of my culture. And yeah, I was in the South Pacific to help, you know, poor people with their natural resources. And one, they were fine. And two, like they were completely out of the economical system, and they were surviving. They were happy. They tended their gardens like 1 to 2 hours a day. And I just my brain like blew up. I was like, you mean you don't just work all the time to go on a vacation sometimes? And what is this life? And what was I taught? And so
Mhm.
I just live kind of in a sort of shattered mental system of like, I know that there's other ways of being human in this world, and I've experienced them, and also they really don't fit this culture. And I feel like I have needs I can't provide for, and I don't know what's going to happen to my son. And so those are all the things that made me
Mhm.
puke when you were talking.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's beautiful to lay that out, Charlotte, because it's in all of us. Yeah, there is this one model that I'll just say that I carried as a seed. So there's a, all these are just stories. All I do is just tell stories about these experimental other ways of being that I found largely to be outrageously joyful, to the point where I feel sort of guilty for like how much meaning and joy I get to experience in a given day, even though other people find it horrifying that my parents are like, voluntary impoverishment. Gosh, what a reckless and terrible thing that you're doing. No, they've come around. They get it a little bit more now. But so when I was in my early 20s, I heard about these farmers who were interested in farming. They had farmed. They were quite experienced. They were actually all from Europe, and they had settled in this town that's in the greater Boston area. So land values were such that no one was farming there anymore. And there's plenty of places like that in America, right? It's just impossible, given the price of land, to make any kind of business plan that would pay off the mortgage for land. And so some people like offered them land, and things were kind of congealing, and they came up with this, what I'd say was a pretty radical vision for a community farm. And they invited 30 interested households to gather in a circle in person, and they described what they thought it would cost them to grow food for these families for the entire year. They were quite experienced, so they had a pretty good sense of what it would be to, like, run a tractor, get the seeds they needed. Anyway, detailed budget requests, which included their farmer stipends. And then they invited people. They went around the circle, and people pledged different amounts of money until the budget was covered. And it worked. They had to go around a couple of times, but they did it face to face, right? So radical, right? To get Americans talking about money openly with one another. Well, and they're still at it 40 years later. And it's called Temple Wilton Community Farm. They were one of the first CSA farms in the country. Almost every other CSA went to basically market norms, set subscription price. If you need to request for a low income share, do it quietly on the side. There might be a couple of those. Ask the farmer. And so 20 some years later, this seed germinated for me in my days. And so I thought, well, it was time to make a pilgrimage to that farm and meet those old farmers. 2 of the 3 of them are still alive. And the story that they told me kind of blew it open for me, what this means and what it could mean, and what the longing that's beneath the surface of some of this work. So a few years in, to their experiment, community farm experiment, a woman came to one of the farmers ahead of the annual meeting and said, my husband and I both lost our jobs. We're going to have to drop out of the farm. We love being a part of this, but we lost our jobs. We're going to have to drop out of the farm. And the farmer suddenly knew what he needed to say, which was, I think you could do us as the farmers and the membership as a whole a real favor if you came to the meeting and you pledged zero. I don't think he thought she would have the courage to do it, but she did. And then this farmer, I'm sitting with this farmer there at the farm, and he says, there wasn't a dry eye in the circle. These are mostly pretty much middle-class people that are part of this farm. And so the question for me is, why were they all weeping? I mean, he said it was like, it would have been downright embarrassing if they were in public. And there's a lot of ways to answer that question, but one of them is that they got to see in themselves the capacity to sustain their neighbor, the willingness, because clearly they covered the budget without this. Then a couple months later, they got jobs and they contributed money and that window closed. But while it was open, they got to see themselves as people who had the capacity to behave in those neighborly ways, which means that on their day, on their rainy day, there might be others who would do that for them. And they got to stop defending themselves against their neighbors for a couple of months. And that's what the work means to me, is kind of reclaiming that sense of those atrophied capacities, I guess.
Adam, you kind of touched on this already, but I may ask you to go further if you can. I have two very conflicting questions, but the one that I want to ask first is I'm reflecting on this idea of for me, if somebody opens a door for me, I'm like, oh my God, thank you. I'm not worthy, and this idea of I can't thank you enough for doing this thing for me. Can you share your reflections on that idea?
Oh, I mean, the worthiness piece sits at the center of this. That's what I have to wrestle with. And I've been working at it for years. And I still, today, my neighbors, I knew they had so much going on. They had an emergency this morning when I stopped over there, and I'm going to ask them to borrow the car. And I didn't do it ahead of time, And it's so much easier to be the one that extends generosity, but you don't have a neighborhood if everyone is trying to be the generous one. A friend of mine loves to say, everyone wants to be the one that lends their lawnmower or their tractor. And then you get the world that we have now, which is every single house on my street, everyone has their own tractor. It's an ecological disaster. So what is in us that became so unworthy? If I had to think back to that Old Sally, that mythical character, Old Sally, the way I've imagined it is that because Old Sally had to sit there on her porch and watch her neighbors gift her thousands of hours of labor to keep her cows milked and mucked and keep her house stocked with firewood, and right? How does she bear it? I'm not saying it was totally comfy for her necessarily. I mean, I'm just guessing. But my guess is that she went through her days not primarily as a person who was in pursuit of money, but as a person who was in pursuit of healthy relationships. And so she'd gone through her life up to that point neighboring actively. And so then when it came to her time to receive, it wasn't quite so difficult. That's one thought. That something happens when we become people whose primary job is to go seek dollars first and foremost, and then consume things. Something happens in the psyche or the heart or something.
I also wonder if this has to do with our breakaway from relationship to land, because people have been on the receiving end of abundance and land that just grows food. And so maybe we were more practiced in in being indebted to a place, and
Mhm.
and that practice kind of then could be extended outward to our human people.
Mhm.
I wonder if there's something in that about farming or about land tending that
Hmm.
just rebuild that muscle for um,
Mhm. Was there a second part of that question that you
No,
want to go
there
back?
was it's a very different question, and I'm like almost
Or-
embarrassed to even ask it because
Please
like
please don't be embarrassed.
well, this like capitalism brain is like, but what
Yeah.
about like paying off your mortgage, or like what about paying
Yeah,
off
yeah, yeah,
your
yeah.
car, your
No,
student?
it's a great question. Let's get into the money. So I I became debt free a year and a half before the pandemic. I grew up in an upper middle class family. I went to an Ivy League college. Like this, we got to talk about privilege here, right? Because this is at the heart of it. Someone had the courage to, after a talk I gave, to raise their hand. It was the first question, and she said, "How is this generosity you're describing not a luxury?" It made me really mad when she asked it, but I've realized since that this is a person who really cares about me. So it was actually a local talk. And what she was saying is this privilege question is going to be in the back of people's minds anywhere you go and talk. You better practice how you are going to answer this question or respond to it preemptively. My grandmother's second husband had money and paid, so I had no college loans because he started a college fund for me when I was born. So here I am, beneficiary of the Colonial Project and its subsidiaries, and am a person who's European American, able-bodied. I'm a gay man, but it's not really a big knock against you anymore. And what do you do when you realize that your being in the world has made a dent that is unbearable to look at square? And my answer, it came in slowly and painfully. It was just like, well, I think it's my responsibility to take risks that I would never ask anyone else to take first, and invite people who maybe are willing to look at the grief of what it is to be a modern, affluent person and say, what do we do now? That's why I call it voluntary impoverishment, because there's a lot of people for whom impoverishment is not voluntary. And that I'm not like, if everyone who's heading up the ladder needs to get to the top before they realize what a hollow promise it was, there won't be much world left if that happens. But maybe the folks at the top could stop telling a victory story about how great it is up here, and maybe start admitting it's a little bit lonely to live from money rather than from relationships. That's an honest answer to that. So I didn't have loans to pay, and I have a cell phone that's $12 a month, and I borrow cars and I contribute money towards cars. Anyway, so I'm able to live very inexpensively. I don't pay rent. My house is paid off. It's a 200 square foot tiny house. Those are some of the details, I think, in your question.
You have health insurance?
I have Medicaid.
You're on Medicaid. Okay.
Yeah. But the farm doesn't have any insurance. And so far, the board has been willing to go with me on that. At least they haven't, or they just haven't. Because I'm really interested in what happens if one of the buildings burns down. How do we ask the neighbors? We can go and ask the Amish down the road how they do it when their barns burn down.
Any other thoughts or questions? Barbara, I want to reach out to you knowing that you work with a refugee population and that your day-to-day experiences with people who are very resource constrained. And I'm wondering your thoughts about Adam's presentation today. Hate to put you on the spot, but totally interested.
Well, yeah. So Barbara Eisworth, Iskashita Refugee Network. We're a gleaning network. We just took harvesting out of our name a couple of years ago because people kept asking me if I harvest refugees. So, yeah, learning how to live with less is really easy when working with and living among refugees who are extremely resilient and have been, and they wouldn't be resilient and have made it here as 1% of the 10 million refugees or displaced peoples in the world. The fact that we're dismantling that whole program globally and nationally and locally is a day-to-day struggle. But I better get it together because the Arizona Attorney General is coming to Tucson tonight, and I've been asked to be a plant in the audience. So I will speak for farmers. I'm not a farmer. I don't even like gardens. I love plants. Don't get me wrong. I just think that gleaning is a much more fruitful way for already poverty-stricken refugee families to obtain large amounts of food to supply their conglomerate large families, all attracted here for a new leash on hope. And I tried that whole poverty thing for the first 10 years of 22 years of gleaning. And something Adam said really struck me, like nothing is free, because I don't know how many times we get, well, I'm giving you the fruit, so why, yeah, you're giving me fruit that takes a crew of 8 people 2 hours to harvest. Yes, I understand it's free, except the grapefruits in southern Arizona are really large and you can't stuff them into your gas tank. So what are we to do? But should I meet more of this with gratitude rather than anger and fear? Yes. So I'm not sure I answered the question. And I'll get my act together before tonight.
My name's Tom.
Hey,
I'm
Tom.
glad to be here, Adam. And you look familiar. I think I may have had the pleasure of listening to you on a Fruition Seeds event, but I'm not sure.
Yep.
Okay. So I'm trying to process a lot of this, and I see a great benefit in what you and your community are doing, and I'm seeing a benefit for anyone that wishes to try to, has a pull, an internal pull, call it a spiritual pull or an act of love, or that sense of being inside that drives so many people for something more than maybe whatever they have.
Mm-hmm.
And you've used the term generosity quite often. And I remember presenting a concept 10 or 12 years ago up your way, actually, at an event with the Institute of Religion in an Age of Science. And I rolled out a big poster. And I didn't use the term generosity. I used the term giving, or goodness, excuse me. I was trying to find my title. It's been a while. I can't find it, but something about the power of goodness. And it all had to do with helping take care of people that were food insecure. I didn't know much about gleaning at the time, but the concept was the same, helping others. And there was a very prominent, well-known, generous lady who read my whole PowerPoint and said, Tom, you're talking about generosity, not goodness. And I thought, oh, so I had something to think about. But back to my main point is that your community, maybe you as sort of the inspiration, I would say in a loving way that you're experimenting, you're on the margin.
Mhm, mhm,
You're an innovator and an inventor from the situation of your upbringing.
mhm.
And there's this community that you described. I wish I knew more about. I'm just processing this. That's happy to be part of this. That is key for me, because what that means is there's a foundation. You've kind of created a foundation, maybe a spiritual foundation centered around farming and food that allows anyone to participate in accordance with what they're able to. And we mentioned the word fear, so it would be very fearful for many people to go maybe too far immediately, but they're surrounded by good neighbors and everything's good about this, and they have a sense, well, maybe I can help with, maybe I'll help with Adam's studies, or maybe I'll help him this way.
Mhm,
That's a beginning,
mhm.
and it's personal. It's deeply personal.
It's not institutional.
Nope, it's about, and let's say it's about me and my search and my journey. So you provide this framework, and maybe there's a fella in the community that's on the way other end of the spectrum, very margin capital, and he says, I'll go ahead and donate to Adam, and that'll check that box. And oftentimes that person might be criticized by others. Maybe call it like greenwashing would be a term, to be critical of people that are just checking a box. And yet that's the wrong, of course, that's the wrong spirit. So that's how I'm evaluating this now. I'm involved in thinking through things myself, a lot of gleaning related about people that are food insecure. And I had an instance the other day where I was asked to cover a Zoom call for a group of people. And I was struggling with it. I was internally struggling, like, the negative thinking, like, oh, I'm put out, I have to get, blah, blah, blah. And somewhere along the lines, I was able to do a shift. And I said, Tom, gratitude is an action word. Where I'm at now, gratitude is an action word.
Mhm.
Without some sort of action to express, it's hollow. And so in terms of helping these people out, like people help you out, right? For me, recognizing that this was giving me an opportunity to express gratitude changed my whole outlook. And all of a sudden I became really excited and grateful about this opportunity. So that's just a little example I'm personally sharing about how I try to process
Mhm.
information. It should not be difficult to process these sorts of things, but it is sometimes, I think, for a lot of people. I had a situation come up here in my community where I was, because of the new administration, I lost my job. Well, thank you very much. New administration, Tom's out. And I'm too old to be, able to do a lot of things, but I needed, wanted this job. I needed the job. And a friend of mine here in the community, who we share a community garden, we did the census, asked me to write up a little blurb in the community about that incident. And I said, I'm a little bit scared to.
Mhm.
And he said, I respect that. And then about 4 days later, a friend of mine was speaking to a gentleman in this community, and not about me, but about the general circumstances of losing jobs over the situation. And he said, well, somebody loses their job, I guess they have to leave the community. So that's a pretty hard but real perspective of, this community at large.
Mhm. There's a word that might have been in what you were saying that you didn't use, but I've been really focusing on recently, is trust. That what you were saying, if anyone in town is going to get involved in this project, they have to trust me and the other people who are representing the work. Not that like there's so many people who represent the work, but obviously I'm the only one who's doing this full time out of the central group of people. So, but man, trust is a slippery thing, right? How do we hold on to it too tight and then you've killed it, right? And in this moment that a couple of people have alluded to around the loss of federal funds. So my parents have been quite involved with being of assistance to to refugees in their community in Vermont. And a lot of that funding is disappearing. That was, say, paying rent for them to have housing. And I've noticed, and I love my parents, and I think a lot of the reason I'm able to do my work is because of their influence on me. And because I talk to them so much about this kind of stuff, I'm going to tell the story on them, which is then my mom was saying, well, what are they going to do? What are these people going to do? And there's this whole group of them that are connected to the church that like help give the kids ride to soccer and teach English. And I think that group of people could chip in and cover the rent, and it probably they wouldn't even have to skip a vacation. And so what is it in us that trusts the money to pass through these anonymous channels more than we trust ourselves to decide how to help one another financially? And I think it's something to think about, because it's going to become increasingly urgent that we reclaim that capacity to trust that we could release dollars directly to other people rather than having it have to become institutionalized. And I know I'm saying that to a bunch of folks who work for nonprofits, but I mean, I'm so into people asking their neighbors to sustain them, because I think it's so transformative. It's really vulnerable. Like, people who are getting involved with the farm have experimented with that and found it to be incredibly powerful. But it's tender.
Just a thought, Adam.
Mhm.
There's a book out called The Poor House, and it traces the institution of government-run poorhouses to over the course and from colonial times. And it has quite a section on the area that you currently live in. And just to say that institutional responses to poverty have been with us as long as your Aunt Mabel story. So the two coexist, and thinking about one or the other, I mean, I'll just come right out and say I'm an institutionalist. I'm a democratic socialist. I firmly believe in the role of government. I hear what you're saying. It has been a tradition within the United States, to be sure, a tradition of self-sufficiency, a tradition of neighborliness. But there's also another tradition that has lived alongside that. So just if you have time, you may want to look at the book, The Poor House, may want to think about the role of government. I certainly do all the time. So those are just my thoughts.
I'd love to read that book.
Yeah, it's a good one. Wagner.
Almost every town in this area has a poor farm road.
Yep. We have a incredible one here. I live in Oregon that has been converted to a luxury hotel. So if you're ever here, Edgefield is kind of cool. But yeah, thinking about that collectivity of the poorhouse, it really delves into some of how it wasn't completely a system of oppression. There was some community that was built around that by the people that live there. But anyway, those are my thoughts. We're at the 11 o'clock hour. Are there any other closing thoughts? Adam, thank you so much. Charlotte, thank you. I know dealing with the logistics has been a challenge, so thank you for hanging in there, and thank you, Adam.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.